where does that boundary lie between what is my business and what is the supplier?
Well, you may as well plan to get ransomware right now if you don't have a framework for managing your risk.
We wanted in this podcast the listeners to sort of have some relevance in terms of hot news. So we had a hot news section. The concept of this in the next few minutes is we're going to go through what's going on in the world right now and try and bring it back to supply management and some of the challenges around it. So even though I think businesses over the last 25 years globalisation, 30 years globalisation has been a topic. We've seen them talk about establishing those widespread supply chains. I think the series of events that's happened over the last 5+ years has really challenged that somewhat. So I think, memory serves me right, 2016 Brexit was announced, and from that was a slew of conversations about trade deals and free market access, which was challenging supply lines and suppliers and buyers equally. And that didn't appear solved by any measure until the pandemic came along in sort of March 2020, which then had a different take on supply chains and supplier demand, which was the resources conducting the work from either building the product to actually getting it to the customer was then challenged in terms of the number of people who were available to do it because of the pandemic. And I don't think we've even emerged from the pandemic. Slightly, we're getting better, and then we have now this unrest in Europe and Ukraine, and that further is challenging supply lines for very different reasons. But I think what you can see over the last 5 years with those topics, or those series of events, should I say, that vendor management is like hard, right? It's tough. It's post-contract management of your suppliers is difficult, whether you're the customer, buyer, supplier. And perhaps it's always been difficult, maybe since 2008, since the financial bump that we had caused a lot more regulation, a lot more focus in this space to be borne out. So hot news, like I said, conversation topic one, rising energy costs. So how does this impact contract obligations? Should organisations be flexible to pricing changes? Obviously, we've got that rising costs coming through. That is going to have to be borne somewhere. Gents, wanted to get your thoughts on this. So Jesse, you first.
Sure. This rising energy cost puts pressure on margin ultimately. If it's different kinds of pressure, but you have to understand the impact of just commodity inflation, right? The energy costs that have to do with constructing and transporting elements that form up, whatever is, let's say, in your supply chain has to come together and then bringing that to market ultimately. That's something that you're going to probably think of as just, it may not always go up and down, but inflationary pressure. You have to understand how that's ultimately what cost you're going to put forward. And then there's interesting things now, like it's not just the cost of that resource has increased, therefore costs more to build and ship around, move around the commodity. Well, in conflict zones, you have all kinds of new fuel costs because you have to use more, right? The airspace is closed over this way. So if you are in Europe and you're still dependent on some Russian crude or gas, that's going to get to you potentially in a different way. Even if it's the same stuff, there might be plenty more transportation costs just because it has to go so much further to get around all this risk and terrible conflict and everything. So the first step that our community would say you should do is kind of model and understand that. And this is a larger topic, but pursuant to a framework of how you manage risk generally. But then you're going to want to build in some alternatives, right? So if your supply chain is so cost efficient that the very cheapest widgets come from very far away, part of understanding and being not so dependent on shipping, which means you could be really rocked when energy costs go up, well, that means considering onshoring or maybe what we might call friend shoring, so that everything required to assemble what it is that you sell and goods you need to move around, all that distance around the planet is much reduced. And maybe some unit rates are higher, but there's less energy, at least in terms of the shipping and stuff that you might need to use, and you'd be less dependent on foreign energy generally, or unfriendly shores potentially. that might introduce at least some stability and at least a great story of staying out of conflict zones, et cetera. At some point, you have to invest into how you manage this risk. You can't be excellent at managing risk and carving every single penny and pence out of the unit rate of producing things, right? It requires some investment, and some of that to get around this energy trouble might involve, just really carefully understanding those things and building in that sort of flexibility and levers you can pull in their supply chain.
So that's some great sort of proactive advice for companies to go out, or people that look after suppliers to go out and try and protect themselves against these sort of unknowns. I think you run a growing business, right? So I'm part of that. So I know intimately what you and I do on a day-to-day basis. At a more basic level, if you had suppliers approaching you now with cost increases due to rising cost of energy, etc., what would you think your response would be? How would you deal with that? Because that's likely to be happening now to some companies.
I was going to say the first aspect I think about in terms of that, well, it's a macro rise for everyone, and I think what it really flushes out is that you need to have a real partnership with your suppliers and between the supplier and buyer, because you have to endeavour to get the best value and lower risk together, and that therefore you need that collaboration, you need that openness to be able to do that. And if you look at the flip side, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is then you're going into a potentially a sourcing activity, which is costly, takes a long time, when a lot of the solution could be right there in front of you with your existing supplier base.
Yeah, the risk is that sourcing activity, you might end up in exactly the same place again, because like you said, it's rising for everyone, so you might not get that efficiency.
Absolutely. So that
out the frying pan into the fire.
That value saving on the surface by switching supplier, let's say, may not actually be the total total cost ownership of going with or keeping with an existing supplier, which may look more expensive on the surface.
So it sounds like what you're saying there is look at, really before you leap, look at the cost of change, right? Because the cost of change,
Exactly.
You helping your supplier out with some bigger bills and potentially increasing your costs for a little while might be better off than the cost of change and you going through that entire exercise, right? Which could be painful.
Exactly. There's one concept that I've come across in the field, which is really about being a trusted buyer as well. Yeah. So it's not only a one directional way. There's a lot of big organizations that I've spoken to that where they want to look like a respectable buyer,
do you want to dig into that?
Mess suppliers around.
I'll make air quotes here, it's terrible. Sort of the trusted element. Do you want to dig into that in terms of what the trusted partner, trusted supplier, trusted buyer, what do you want to give some context around what that means?
First of all, it's really about communication in the first place. Yeah. So there's got to be open channels of communication on a regular cadence, and not only not at a pinch point, right? So that's got to be across the different roles and functions that are interface between the buyer and the supplier. And I think that really helps facilitate that transparency, which then gives you that trust, because without that transparency, without maybe holding things back in a relationship, you're never really going to get that trust. And then how can you use that going forward to solve problems together? And
you kind of indicated that there was less, like the trusted buyer, there was more emphasis on being a trusted buyer as opposed to, do you see that sometimes skipped over? It's very much that supplier needs to be trusted. It's all supplier centric. Is that kind of what you was getting at?
Yeah, I think that's that tends to be where on the surface where people look at this dynamic of a relationship, right? It's always the supplier needs to be the trusted part of that partnership, and less emphasis is really thought about, well, what does it take to be a good buyer?
Yeah, how do I make this supplier successful, kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly.
We see that a lot, right? In terms of, we ask them to do a lot of things, but what's my skin in the game, and that's sometimes overlooked.
That's the one thing. So I think Tony's spot on. Part of the investment is not just investing in frameworks and policies and stuff, but it is investing in that relationship. If you have invested in the relationship with your supplier, or your supplier with your buyer, then that's something to draw upon when times get a little tough. So the challenge is, of course, the enterprise has devoted, limited, and resourcing into the building and establishing and maintaining those relationships. That's manual work, right? But I think the pattern we see in the market is until that supplier costs us a certain eye-watering amount, we will not break off the time of a professional to engage with them and build a relationship. We will not have time, and therefore it's essentially transactional, except, by and large, I'm painting with a broad brush right here. So that's a shame. And we've seen the returns that can be reaped if you find ways, modern ways, to engage those suppliers at much bigger scale and rely on some, modern methods and tools to do that sort of thing, so that there is a history, a fact-based conversation to have, a relationship to some degree that makes sense for the tier of vendor that they are to your organization.